information age and the global society, to unleash the limitless potential of all our people, and yes, to form a more perfect union. When last we gathered, our march to this new future seemed less certain than it does today. We vowed then to set a clear course to renew our nation. In these 4 years, we have been touched by tragedy, exhilarated by challenge, strengthened by achievement. America stands alone as the world's indispensable nation. Once again, our economy is the strongest on earth. Once again, we are building stronger families, thriving communities, better educational opportunities, a cleaner environment. Problems that once seemed destined to deepen now bend to our efforts. Our streets are safer, and record numbers of our fellow citizens have moved from welfare to work. And once again, we have resolved for our time a great debate over the role of government. Today we can declare government is not the problem, and government is not the solution. We, the American people, we are the solution. Our founders understood that well and gave us a democracy strong enough to endure for centuries, flexible enough to face our common challenges and advance our common dreams in each new day. As times change, so government must change. We need a new government for a new century, humble enough not to try to solve all our problems for us, but strong enough to give us the tools to solve our problems for ourselves. A government that is smaller, lives within its means, and does more with less. Yet where it can stand up for our values and interests around the world, and where it can give Americans the power to make a real difference in their everyday lives, government should do more, not less. The preeminent mission of our new government is to give all Americans an opportunity, not a guarantee, but a real opportunity to build better lives. Beyond that, my fellow citizens, the future is up to us. Our founders taught us that the preservation of our liberty and our union depends upon responsible citizenship. And we need a new sense of responsibility for a new century. There is work to do, work that government alone cannot do. Teaching children to read, hiring people off welfare rolls, coming out from behind locked doors and shuttered windows to help reclaim our streets from drugs and gangs and crime, taking time out of our own lives to serve others. Each and every one of us, in our own way, must assume personal responsibility, not only for ourselves and our families, but for our neighbors and our nation. Our greatest responsibility is to embrace a new spirit of community for a new century. For any one of us to succeed, we must succeed as one America. The challenge of our past remains the challenge of our future. Will we be one nation, one people with one common destiny or not? Will we all come together or come apart? The divide of race has been America's constant curse. And each new wave of immigrants gives new targets to old prejudices. Prejudice and contempt, cloaked in the pretense of religious or political convictions, are no different. These forces have nearly destroyed our nation in the past. They plague us still. They fuel the fanaticism of terror, and they torment the lives of millions in fractured nations all around the world. These obsessions cripple both those who hate and, of course, those who are hated, robbing both of what they might become. We cannot, we will not succumb to the dark impulses that lurk in the far regions of the soul everywhere. We shall overcome them. And we shall replace them with the generous spirit of a people who feel at home with one another. Our rich texture of racial, religious, and political diversity will be a godsend in the 21st century. Great rewards will come to those who can live together, learn together, work together, forge new ties that bind together. As this new era approaches, we can already see its broad outlines. 10 years ago, the internet was the mystical province of physicists. Today, it is a commonplace encyclopedia for millions of school children. Scientists now are decoding the blueprint of human life. Cures for our most feared illnesses seem close at hand. The world is no longer divided into two hostile camps. Instead, now we are building bonds with nations that once were our adversaries. Growing connections of commerce and culture give us a chance to lift the fortunes and spirits of people the world over. And for the very first time in all of history, more people on this planet live under democracy than dictatorship. My fellow Americans, as we look back at this remarkable century, we may ask, can we hope not just to follow, but even to surpass the achievements of the 20th century in America, and to avoid the awful bloodshed that stained its legacy? To that question, every American here and every American in our land today must answer a resounding yes. This is the heart of our task. With a new vision of government, a new sense of responsibility, a new spirit of community, we will sustain America's journey. The promise we sought in a new land, we will find again in a land of new promise. In this new land, education will be every citizen's most prized possession. Our schools will have the highest standards in the world, igniting the spark of possibility in the eyes of every girl and every boy. And the doors of higher education will be open to all. The knowledge and power of the information age will be within reach not just of the few, but of every classroom, every library, every child. Parents and children will have time not only to work, but to read and play together. And the plans they make at their kitchen table will be those of a better home, a better job, the certain chance to go to college. Our streets will echo again with the laughter of our children, because no one will try to shoot them or sell them drugs anymore. Everyone who can work will work, with today's permanent underclass part of tomorrow's growing middle class. New miracles of medicine at last will reach not only those who can claim care now, but the children and hard-working families too long denied. We will stand mighty for peace and freedom and maintain a strong defense against terror and destruction. Our children will sleep free from the threat of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. Ports and airports, farms and factories will thrive with trade and innovation and ideas. And the world's greatest democracy will lead a whole world of democracies. Our land of new promise will be a nation that meets its obligations, a nation that balances its budget, but never loses the balance of its values. A nation where our grandparents have secure retirement and health care, and their grandchildren know we have made the reforms necessary to sustain those benefits for their time. A nation that fortifies the world's most productive economy, even as it protects the great natural bounty of our water, air, and majestic land. And in this land of new promise, we will have reformed our politics so that the voice of the people will always speak louder than the din of narrow interests, regaining the participation and deserving the trust of all Americans. Fellow citizens, let us build that America, a nation ever moving forward toward realizing the full potential of all its citizens. Prosperity and power, yes, they are important, and we must maintain them. But let us never forget the greatest progress we have made and the greatest progress we have yet to make is in the human heart. In the end, all the world's wealth and 1,000 armies are no match for the strength and decency of the human spirit. "34 years ago, the man whose life we celebrate today spoke to us down there at the other end of this mall in words that moved the conscience of a nation. Like a prophet of old, he told of his dream that one day America would rise up and treat all its citizens as equals before the law and in the heart. Martin Luther King's dream was the American dream. His quest is our quest, the ceaseless striving to live out our true creed. Our history has been built on such dreams and labors, and by our dreams and labors, we will redeem the promise of America in the 21st century. To that effort, I pledge all my strength and every power of my office. I ask the members of Congress here to join in that pledge. The American people returned to office a president of one party and a Congress of another. Surely they did not do this to advance the politics of petty bickering and extreme partisanship they plainly deplore. No, they call all us instead to be repairers of the breach and to move on with America's mission. America demands and deserves big things from us, and nothing big ever came from being small. Let us remember the timeless wisdom of Cardinal Bernardin when facing the end of his own life. He said, "It is wrong to waste the precious gift of time on acrimony and division." Fellow citizens, we must not waste the precious gift of this time. For all of us are on that same journey of our lives. And our journey, too, will come to an end. But the journey of our America must go on. And so, my fellow Americans, we must be strong, for there is much to dare. The demands of our time are great, and they are different. Let us meet them with faith and courage, with patience and a grateful, happy heart. Let us shape the hope of this day into the noblest chapter in our history. Yes, let us build our bridge. A bridge wide enough and strong enough for every American to cross over to a blessed land of new promise. May those generations whose faces we cannot yet see, whose names we may never know, say of us here that we led our beloved land into a new century with the American dream alive for all her children, with the American promise of a more perfect union, a reality for all her people, with America's bright flame of freedom spreading throughout all the world. From the height of this place and the summit of this century, let us go forth. May God strengthen our hands for the good work ahead, and always, always bless our America.
Well, it was Dr. Billy Graham who said in the invocation, asked the President to give us a vision of what he wanted America to become, and
Mr. President,
you all across the nation have
thank you for that
had a chance to hear what is so widely regarded as a very important opportunity for the President to talk to us all as a nation. And you will have all formed your individual impressions about how he communicated with you. But just before we continue with the rest of the ceremony, some quick reaction to what sort of an impression he made on Washington. Sam Donaldson.
Well, I think it was a good speech, almost poetic at spots. Land of a new promise, progress is in the human heart. But the president's main theme, I think, he laid out was the one of the campaign, when he said government is not the problem and government is not the solution. So wherever triangulation is, Mr. Clinton has served notice that he's going to be in the middle for the next 4 years.
Thank you, Sam. Koki Roberts.
Well, that new land of promise was quite visionary, and it was interesting that he then referred to Martin Luther King's dream, because it was as if he were talking about his dream for the future as well. But he's not going to have an easy time. I mean, today is the day to give him all the credit, but that cutting back on government is going to meet with some real opposition in his own party when he talks about new government and making government smaller.
Thank you, Koki. Thank you, Sam. We'll come back to the others shortly. But for the moment, the Emmanuel Baptist Church Sanctuary Choir. President's own choir, the Emmanuel Baptist Church Sanctuary Choir and Orchestra from Little Rock, Arkansas. The President's been a member since 1980. They keep his choir robe number 192, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And now just a couple of other quick Washington observations about the President's speech before we continue. George Stephanopoulos, I know you were anticipating the President might talk a lot about race. He did.
And he sure did. This was a very personal speech for the President. It hit on his favorite themes of opportunity, responsibility, and community. And I think the most lasting part of the speech is where he talked about the constant curse of race and summoned up the spiritual to say, we shall overcome them. I think he sees this as central to his historic legacy.
Okay, we'll come back in a moment to others. For only the third time in inauguration, we shall have a poet. Miller Williams, professor of English from the University of Arkansas, is going to read a poem.
Of history and hope. We have memorized America, how it was born, and who we have been, and where. In ceremonies and silence, we say the words, telling the stories, singing the old songs. We like the places they take us. Mostly we do. The great and all the anonymous dead are there. We know the sound of all the sounds we brought. The rich taste of it is on our tongues. But where are we going to be? And why? And who? The disenfranchised dead want to know. We mean to be the people we meant to be, to keep on going where we meant to go. But how do we fashion the future? Who can say how? Except in the minds of those who will call it now, the children. The children. And how does our garden grow? With waving hands, oh, rarely in a row, and flowering faces and brambles that we can no longer allow. Who were many people coming together cannot become one people falling apart. Who dreamed for every child an even chance cannot let luck alone turn doorknobs or not. Whose law was never so much of the hand as the head cannot let chaos make its way to the heart. Who have seen learning struggle from teacher to child cannot let ignorance spread itself like rot. We know what we have done and what we have said, how we have grown degree by slow degree, believing ourselves toward all we have tried to become, just and compassionate, equal, able, and free. All this in the hands of children, eyes already set on a land we never can visit. It isn't there yet. But looking through their eyes, we can see what our long gift to them may come to be if we can truly remember. They will not forget.
Miller Williams, professor of English from the University of Arkansas, who said his goal was to write a poem that is worthy of the American people, and who had something of a difficult time in the last few days, had to finally take his phone off the hook so he could phone it because so many people were interested in what he had to say. We will be right back to continue this inaugural ceremony. Inauguration Day, just before we come back to the conclusion of the inaugural ceremony, it's been unfair not to hear from George Will on the subject of the speech. George.
Peter, an understandable wish was father of the thought that I think was the hinge on which the speech turned, and that was the line where the president said, "We have resolved for our time a great debate over the role of government. For our time may end tomorrow morning." He used 6 times in his speech the word responsibility or some permutation of it. And of course, what we argue about in the United States endlessly is who's responsible for what, the government or the individual. That debate will begin again. But the president's speech was a quite thematic plea for an end of partisanship, which he says the American people deplore, which does not explain why they keep giving parts of the government to the different parties.
Balance, George, balance. George Stephanopoulos, you're sitting there beside George. What did you find wrong with this speech? What disappointed you about him?
Well, I think that any speech can't do everything that a new president has to do, even if it is a second term. And I think that I personally would have liked to have seen a little bit more on campaign finance reform. The president had a sentence on it, but it's going to be essential for all politicians to get this solved in the next several months.
Okay, bearing in mind, I do not want under any circumstances to be talking over the national anthem. Let's talk to our historian, Henry Graff. You've read more presidential speeches than anybody. What do you think?
I think that two little observations. I agree with what Koki said, and I agree with what George Stephanopoulos has said. First of all, the president began, "My fellow citizens." That's the first time a president has done that since Roosevelt began the habit in 1945 of having a laundry list of politicians, so that this is a clarion call. It's a trumpet to the people. That's a very good thing. I want also to say that he's not the first one of the presidents to deal with race as a theme. In 1909, William Howard Taft devoted a big portion of his speech to race.
Thank you. Santita Jackson, the national anthem, the eldest of Reverend Jesse Jackson's 5 children. Santita Jackson singing the national anthem, with in the background the Resurrection Choir, which we referred to earlier, those people from various, almost a dozen houses of worship around the country, which were destroyed by arson over the past year, or the past 14 months. I want to go down to the West Lawn now, where Michelle McQueen is, I think, with some people from Chicago.
Yes, Peter, I've been visiting with John Velasquez and Anthony Russo, who are law students and friends, but John is a Democrat and Anthony is a Republican. So give the president's speech a grade. Since you're law students, I'll ask you to give a grade for a change.
I'd give it a B+.
C plus.
Why do you give it a B+?
Because I think he was telling us as Americans, you know, we've got community and individual responsibility to think about the 21st century. It's a great speech.
You liked it. It was a great speech to you.
Oh, I thought it was really great.
What about you? A C+ for you? That's kind of a lousy grade.
I think it lacked in depth and delivery. I believe that he really hasn't given us a clear vision of what his future America looks like.
No partisanship there, I think. But it's good that, I think this expresses the spirit of this crowd, though, Peter. You have people who came down here, not because they're especially partisan, but because they really have a strong feeling about the country, and there is some disagreement, but there's overall a good feeling about the day.
I was going to ask you, a Republican there, Michelle, whether or not anything changed his mind even a whit today, or did he decide on that speech beforehand?
Peter would like to know if anything you heard today changed your mind at all about the president, or had you already made up your mind about the speech before you got here?
I can't say that I made up my mind before I got here. I just feel that he really has left me with, he hasn't changed my mind at all in terms of my perception of his vision.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Michelle. We'll be back to you if you find someone else interesting down there as well. We enjoy it. Hal Bruno, our political director, is here. Hal, how quickly is this town going to turn back to straight politics?
Oh, I'd say about 12 hours, 14 hours maybe. What struck me about the speech was the emphasis on change. You'd expect that in a first-term inaugural speech, but this is a second one. The other interesting thing is the biggest applause line out of the 15 came when he appealed for the Republican Congress to work together with the Democratic president. That told you something.
George Will took note of the fact that there was great response for this bipartisanship thing as well, but pointed out that the people elected House, now Senate in one, and the White House in the other, balanced. Jeff Greenfield's over on the west side of the Capitol. Jeff Greenfield, impressions?
Well, Peter, when he spoke about race, I thought the speech took flight. It was tough. The language was original. But at the risk of being the skunk at the garden party, I do think much of this is what I would call inaugural boilerplate. When people try to write a speech to have vision, the speech doesn't have vision because the words and the images are borrowed. Now, President Clinton has always been an empathetic rather than a ceremonial speaker. This isn't going to make much of a difference. But if you're playing to the historical galleries to be in the pantheon of great inaugural speeches, this was not one of them. Peter?
What about America, Jeff, standing alone as the world's indispensable nation?
Well, this has been a theme of presidential speeches going back to Harry Truman in the first post-Cold War speech. And it is a point that is almost unarguable. But when you're giving a speech, the most important thing as a retired speechwriter is fresh images. And I think even presidents get intimidated by history, and they feel they have to talk like everybody else. The ghost of John Kennedy is very much in this as in almost every other speech. But as I say, the man's been elected to a second term, so give him credit for that.
Okay, Jeff, thanks very much. From the former speechwriter to the historian. Henry Graff, you don't remember many great lines from any speeches. The ones that always get quoted, Lincoln's second, John F. Kennedy's.
Right.
And what's the other?
Roosevelt.
And Roosevelt, of course, you have no fear.
Sure. This speech gives evidence of having been worked on. If the president had 12 drafts, there probably were at least 12 people working on it. It's pieced together, consciously designed to get into the quotation books. And there are some good quotes here. I disagree with Jeff on that. I am interested in the fact that even talking about race, he was not as impassioned as William Howard Taft was in 1909, 14 presidents ago. That's 88 years. I hope this time, at least, the message, whether we like the cliches or the form in which the speech was delivered or not, that the message will take.
Okay, let's go up to the front of the Capitol again and talk to a Southern senator. I think Sam Donaldson was Senator Thompson, Tennessee.
That's right, Peter. Fred Thompson from Tennessee. What did you think of the speech?
Well, I thought it was a good speech. I think he expressed the hope that all of us have for the future.
Well, now, he called for a partisanship to die. He said the American people don't want partisanship. Do you think it'll die or not?
Well, you know, partisanship will never die, but there's good kind and bad kind. I mean, honestly, discussing your differences, putting your cards on the table and having a vigorous debate is good. But the pettiness that he referred to is bad. His comment about nothing big ever came out of anything small or something to that effect, I think is right on the money, and I think that we could all take that to heart.
Well, Senator, you're going to be in charge of investigating some of the so-called scandals that have arisen, money, for instance. Yeah. What are you going to do?
Yeah, well, we'll just do our job. Congress has an oversight responsibility in these matters, and it needs to be thorough, it needs to be tough inquiry, but it needs to be fair and even-handed, and that's the way I intend to run it.
Thanks very much, Senator Fred Thompson, Republican of Tennessee. Peter?
Thank you, Sam, very much. Every senator today and every congressman, I suspect, both Republican and Democrat, Republican especially, going to try to be polite and correct before the partisan debate begins again tomorrow. And Senator Thompson, I think, began to allude there. What's wrong with partisanship in politics? It is the pettiness, it's the bickering, but partisanship, that's what politics is all about in some respects. We'll be right back. If you have ever wondered why some president's signatures appear to be choppy, here's the reason. They use so many pens. If we could get rid of that sign there over top of the pens for a moment so that we could see the president's sign. He sometimes just draws a letter. He's in the president's room just outside the Senate chamber, often a place used for presidents to sign documents and legislation. And he is here signing the documents, nominating various senior officials in his administration, most notably his cabinet members, so they can get paid. And there has been a fairly modest but significant turnover in this president's cabinet. He has a new Secretary of State in Madeleine Albright, a new Secretary of Labor in Alexis Herm, a new Secretary of Defense in the former Republican Senator Bill Cohn, new Secretary of Transportation, new Ambassador to the United Nations, a new Secretary of Commerce, and a new Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. That's the second-term cabinet, or at least part of it, actually. Erskine Bowles is his chief of staff, not in the cabinet. But if I could just tell our stations up and down the network, we're going to run over just a couple of minutes here now. All of you expecting all my children. It'll be along very shortly, but we hope you will stay with us while we savor again this rite of passage.
Making this a National Day of Hope and Renewal, embodying the themes of the inaugural address.
What were you referring to when you said nothing big comes from being small?
Is this what I said?
There will not be many exchanges today between the president and reporters, we assume, though the president likes to take the opportunity to get off a quip every now and then in terms of meeting with the press. It would be unrealistic of us probably now to not talk about what is coming along, and while the emphasis today has been all on bipartisanship, and as we've said several times, the celebration of what this means to the country, and by the way, what kind of an ad it is for the rest of the world in terms of the country. You heard the president speak so eloquently about democracy. But tomorrow up there in the House of Representatives, very close by where the president is going to have lunch today, the House is going to vote on the recommended sanctions against the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. So in truth, this is a capital with lots of political crisis ahead of it. ABC's John Cochran covers Capitol Hill for us. John, tell us briefly about what to look at tomorrow.
Well, tomorrow I think the Republicans will not try to lower the punishment level for Newt Gingrich, specifically that $300,000 he's supposed to reimburse Congress. Democrats, on the other hand, are saying they will not try to raise his punishment any, so at least in that little small one regard, they are a little bipartisanship.
Okay, John, thank you very much. Cokie Roberts, who I think is still in the rotunda. Cokie, comments about partisanship aside, what kind of a session does this shape up to be between the Congress and the President, do you think?
Well, I think that both sides, and they've just walked through, the President and Vice President, the leaders of the Congress have just walked through in very jovial spirit right behind me here, everybody happy together for this moment of this day. And they understand that the voters have said that they want cooperation. So you're going to hear from leaders of both parties about common ground and cooperation. But the truth is there are people with some very different agendas here, and I think that you will find the normal bickering that goes on because people have different goals in mind, but added to that, the overlay of bickering because of these scandals and because the Democrats want to retake Congress and the Republicans want to retake the presidency.
Well, we'll get to the president's troubles in just a moment, but Sam Donaldson, if I can ask you, several people around here this weekend think they've been hearing the drums beating for Speaker Gingrich. What do you pick up?
Well, I think Speaker Gingrich is still in trouble, if you mean are his woes all behind him.
No, I was saying the opposite. I'm sorry, I wasn't clear enough.
All right. Well, all right. You're saying that you think he's all out of the woods?
Well, that it's coming.
I think on Tuesday, everything will be reaffirmed. The House will go along with the recommendations of the committee. But it's down the line that he may have some problems because he's going to represent the Republican Party, at least in the House, and he's weakened by all of this scandal, so-called. And even though it's settled, I think in the minds of a lot of people, I think I'd like to see what the poll is is taken right after the House votes on his popularity. It was very low, as you know, before the campaign ended, and if it's even lower, I think the Republicans have a problem with him as the symbol and the leader of what their agenda is going to be.
George, well, let me ask you directly. Do you think that Speaker Gingrich is going to last in his job?
I think he'll last until he's term limited. You know, he said that he set a limit, I guess, of 6 terms. I don't think at this point it's a question of whether or not he helps or hinders the Republicans as much as the Republicans feel they would be hurt or indeed seriously injured if they were to suggest that their choice of Speaker would be conditional upon the Democrats' approval.
Thank you all. Let's go back to the rotunda there where the President has stopped very briefly to say hello, as he so often loves to do, to those members of the public who have managed to make their way in today. And as we heard at the very beginning, it was very difficult. As this day and tomorrow continues, there will be no end of analysis about the President's 4 years ahead and the Speaker's difficulties. But today, from one end of Washington, there were enough people here in the crowds that it almost approximated a throng. And over the weekend here, there's Speaker Gingrich in the foreground. And as people gathered here today, there was a genuine feeling of celebration, less perhaps the celebration of the President or the celebration of his difficulties from members of the other party than it was a celebration, once again, as we have every 4 years, of what America is all about. I hope you'll join us later on World News Tonight. Until then, thanks to all of my colleagues who joined us today. I'm Peter Jennings in Washington.
This has been an ABC News special. Live coverage of Inauguration 97.
This has been a special presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.